History is often written like a theatre script. In this script, the Axis powers were cast as the villains, while the Allies were portrayed as the righteous liberators who arrived to free the world from tyranny. Textbooks, official speeches, and post-war propaganda created a narrative so powerful that entire generations accepted it without question. The Allies were the good side, the side of justice, the side of humanity, but the truth is never that clean. Victory comes with the privilege of shaping memory. The nations that won the war did not just defeat their enemies on the battlefield. They controlled the story afterward. They controlled the photographs that were published, the footage that was shown in cinemas, the reports that were classified, and the words that would be repeated in classrooms for the next century. They decided what would be remembered and what would be quietly erased. As the war drew to its end, the world was desperate for hope. People needed heroes. The images of smiling Allied troops handing out chocolate to children in liberated towns became symbols of salvation. Meanwhile, the less glorious moments were buried beneath the celebration. Civilian cities, reduced to ashes under Allied firebombing, were rebranded as necessary operations. Colonized troops forced into the front lines were labeled as support units instead of frontline soldiers. Strategic betrayals were described as tactical necessities. The public was never told how long the Allies hesitated before opening a second front, even while Soviet cities were burning and millions were dying. They were not told that some leaders considered those losses acceptable if it weakened a future rival. They were not told that entire populations, especially in Eastern Europe and Asia, were deliberately left to fall under new forms of oppression as part of post-war negotiations. The war had been fought in the name of freedom, but freedom was selectively distributed. The myth of the pure Allies became a shield that protected uncomfortable truths. Any criticism of their decisions was seen as disrespectful to the soldiers who lost their lives. And so, silence became the easiest way to maintain the illusion. Silence from governments. Silence from historians who feared backlash. Silence from witnesses who believed no one would listen. Yet history does not disappear. It waits in old archives, in uncensored letters sent from bombed cities, in photographs that were never published, and in the memories of those who saw victory from the ground instead of from a parade stand. Beneath the triumph, there was smoke. Beneath the liberation, there were fires that no official speech ever mentioned. If the Allies fought for humanity, why did some of their actions mirror the destruction they were supposed to end? If justice was their banner, why were some lives considered more valuable than others? And if the war was truly about freedom, why were so many people left without it even after the peace treaties were signed? The world was told a story of good versus evil, but the real war existed in the grey space in between, where decisions were made not in the name of morality, but in the name of strategy, control, and future power. This is where the myth begins to crack. In official timelines, the Allied invasion of Western Europe is celebrated as the moment hope returned to the world. D-Day is described as a heroic turning point, a decisive strike for freedom. But what most people do not know is how long that moment was delayed, and at what cost. Long before Allied troops set foot on the beaches of Normandy, desperate messages were sent from the Eastern Front. Soviet forces, facing relentless German assaults, pleaded for relief. Cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad were drowning in blood and starvation. Entire neighborhoods were burned to ashes. Civilians boiled wallpaper for the glue just to have something to swallow. And still, the Second Front did not open. Western leaders argued that they were not ready, that more preparation was needed, that launching too soon would be a disaster. But some historians suggest another reason, one never printed in official reports. A weakened Soviet Union meant a weaker negotiator in the post-war world. Letting Germany exhaust its strength against the Soviet giant made strategic sense for what came after the war. Millions died while calculations were made in distant rooms. It was not just the Soviet Union that felt the cost of strategic delay. In Warsaw, resistance fighters rose against Nazi occupation, expecting Allied support. They held out for weeks, waiting for supplies that never arrived. They believed the Allies would not let them fall, but no help came. The uprising was crushed, and the city was left in ruins. After the war, Warsaw would not be handed to free Polish leaders, but to a new government aligned with Soviet control. The resistance died not for liberation, but for a political map already drafted without them. In Asia, similar patterns emerged. Some Allied commanders knew of Japanese atrocities in regions like Nanjing and Manila, but chose to prioritize strategic targets instead of civilian rescue. Reports of mass executions and systematic brutality were received but archived. Until a more appropriate time, civilians were left to their fate, not because they were unseen, but because they were not considered strategically important. Documents declassified decades later revealed discussions that treated human losses as numbers on a chart. Military planners spoke of acceptable casualties and necessary sacrifices. These were not the words spoken in public speeches. The same leaders who promised freedom to all did not mention that some lives were considered more expendable than others. The harshest truth is not that mistakes were made, but that some choices were intentional. The Allies fought tyranny, but they also fought for territory, influence, and control over the post-war world. To secure that future position, they allowed the front lines to bleed longer than necessary. They allowed uprisings to fail. They allowed certain regions to fall so they could be reclaimed later, under new political banners. For those watching from below, from the streets covered in rubble and the basements where families hid from bombs, the war did not look like a clean battle between good and evil. It looked like a slow calculation unfolding over years, one in which their suffering was just a variable in a larger equation. Allied soldiers who fought and died believed in liberation. Many officers on the field acted with honor and courage, but somewhere far behind the front lines, men in polished offices made decisions that told another story, a story of delay, of silent compromise, of victories measured in influence rather than lives saved. Wars are remembered for flags raised and victories declared. They are rarely remembered for the moments when help could have come but did not, when a message was received but remained unanswered, when a city waited for salvation and instead met silence. This is not the history shown in parades. This is the history found in classified memos and in the quiet anger of those who survived only to learn that rescue was never truly coming. In most war memorials, the narrative is clear. The Axis powers brought destruction, and the Allies brought liberation. But walk through the ashes of Dresden or the ruins of Tokyo, and another truth begins to surface. Liberation did not always descend from the sky. Sometimes it came in the form of fire. On the night of February 13th, 1945, British and American bombers flew over Dresden, a cultural city with little strategic military value. What followed was not a military strike, but a firestorm. Bombing patterns were calculated not to destroy factories, but to ignite a wall of flame that consumed entire districts. Temperatures soared so high that civilians trying to escape were pulled into the inferno by hurricane-force winds of fire. Thousands were burned alive in a single night. Reports from survivors described the streets as molten rivers of asphalt, where people sank as though the earth itself had turned against them. Yet history books called it a successful operation. Tokyo would soon face a fate even worse. On March 9, 1945, waves of American B-29 bombers dropped incendiary bombs designed specifically to burn wood and paper, the materials that made up most Japanese homes. Within hours, an ocean of fire swept through the city. Mothers clutched children as they ran through streets that glowed red, only to collapse as smoke filled their lungs. More than 100,000 civilians died in one night, a number exceeding even the atomic strike on Nagasaki. The official term used after the attack was strategic bombing. The word massacre was never used. When civilian deaths occurred under Axis bombs, the world called it terror. When they occurred under Allied bombs, it was called necessary. Official reports replaced words like civilians with terms like urban targets. Photographs showing burned parents holding the small, charred remains of their children were not released to the Western public until decades later. The paperwork filed after these attacks did not include the language of guilt. It used the language of efficiency. And then there are the lesser-known cities, wiped from memory. Places in Asia and Eastern Europe where entire populations were caught between two advancing armies. Some villages were destroyed, not by the enemy, but by supposed liberators eliminating what they called resistance zones. These incidents were documented in field reports with detached phrases like area neutralized or collateral suppression. The people who lived there never received a name in the history books. Only their coordinates were recorded. Then a race stopped in the Pacific. Allied forces, driven by rage from earlier defeats, sometimes executed wounded enemies rather than take prisoners. Civilians hiding in basements were sometimes labeled enemy sympathizers and treated accordingly. None of these incidents became headline news. They were buried in footnotes, sealed in military archives, or dismissed as isolated acts of war. But the scale tells another story. If countless isolated incidents appear again and again, they are no longer isolated. They are a pattern. To question these actions is not to defend tyranny, but to reveal the full truth. The war was not a story of saints versus monsters. It was a struggle between powers, and all powers, when pushed to certain limits, reveal what they are truly capable of. The difference lies not in morality, but in who writes the final report. Victors do not stand trial. Victors hold the gavel. When the Nuremberg trials were conducted, leaders from the defeated side were charged for crimes against humanity, and rightly so. But the definition of those crimes did not include the firebombing of civilian populations, because that would have required the victors to judge themselves. And so, the legal definition of war crimes was shaped carefully around actions committed by those who lost. In the official documentaries of the post-war era, footage of smiling Allied soldiers giving chocolate to children became the closing image of the conflict. The camera did not show the burned bodies in Dresden. It did not linger on the blackened ruins of Tokyo, where the smell of smoke and flesh mingled in the air for months. It chose a cleaner ending. Peace was declared. But for those who watched the sky turn to fire, peace was just a word spoken by people who had never stood in the flames. After the war ended, the world wanted closure. Nations needed a clean story to move forward, one that separated good from evil with a single, confident stroke. Complexity was dangerous, doubt was inconvenient, and so The narrative was purified. Schoolbooks spoke of liberation, not negotiation. They listed heroic dates, not delayed decisions. They described moral victories, not strategic sacrifices measured in human lives. The pages showed soldiers raising flags, not civilians searching for loved ones among the ruins left by friendly fire. The victors gave the world a story easy to remember, and even easier to believe. In many countries, archives containing sensitive reports were locked away for decades under the label classified for national interest. Documents that detailed civilian bombings or controversial decisions were either redacted or stored under restricted access. Evidence was hidden not because it was false, but because it was too true. Even the people who lived through these forgotten tragedies learned to remain silent. In Dresden, survivors avoided speaking openly for years, fearing their grief would be seen as criticism of the victors. In Tokyo, entire neighborhoods rebuilt their lives on ashes without ever being asked what they saw that night. The world celebrated an end to war, while those in the shadows learned that history is not always written by those who suffered most, but by those who had the authority to speak. Generations grew up reciting a version of history that had already been cleaned and framed. Children watched documentaries that spoke of Allied glory with cinematic music swelling in the background. They were not shown the faces of burned civilians. They were shown victory parades. And yet, beneath the polished narration, truth still lingers in the gaps, in the slight discomfort of historians who avoid certain questions, in the hesitant pauses of veterans who know more than they are willing to say, in the eyes of the few remaining witnesses who carry memories that do not match the official narrative. History, as it is taught, asks us to celebrate what was won, but real history demands that we also acknowledge what was lost: lives, cities, entire truths. The greatest distortion is not in the lies that are told, but in the truths that are never spoken. The Allies won the war, but in doing so, they gained something just as powerful as victory on the battlefield. They gained control over the memory of the war. And memory, more than any weapon, shapes the world that comes after. If silence once protected the darker side of victory, then breaking that silence is the only way to truly understand the past, because history does not belong only to those who celebrated its ending. It also belongs to those who waited for help that never came, to those who stood beneath a sky that burned, to those whose stories were never written because their pain did not fit the narrative of righteousness. And if these stories remain in the shadows, then the war never truly ended. It simply changed form. If the victors could reshape the past, then what else in history was engineered to be forgotten? If you felt even a moment of doubt, a spark of awareness, do not let it fade. Stories like this disappear when people stop asking questions. Algorithms bury them. Textbooks avoid them. Silence protects them. So if you believe these truths should be heard, share this, comment, keep the discussion alive. And if you are ready to go deeper, to open more files they never wanted you to see, then this is your invitation. Subscribe and prepare for the next revelation. This is Hidden History Files, and we've only just begun.